Friends, welcome to the Word on Sunday, a platform to reflect and pray with the scripture readings of every Sunday. We have begun the season of Lent, the spiritual spring season of our lives. On this very first Sunday of Lent, the readings give us a profound invitation to look at the obedience of Jesus and His will, to do God's will, and avoid sin even amidst the thickness of temptation. On this first Sunday of Lent, we are given this invitation and the message that when tempted, like Jesus, do I find a reference to God and find resource in God. Temptation is strong, but we must be stronger. We need to train our will, but not to rationalize our actions. On this first Sunday of Lent, we get back to the basics, the three basic hungers of humanity. The first reading presents to us the original temptation. We're asked to focus not on the prohibition that God gives, but on the lavishness of permission, which is what not properly understood by our first parents. They focused so much on what was prohibited and so became unable to enjoy the lavishness of permission that God gave them in the Garden of Eden. When we sin, we precisely do what our first parents have done. We focus on what is prohibited and become unable to focus on the lavishness of God's permission. The first parents, instead of saying, "Be merciful to me, O God, for we have sinned," they embraced the blame game, which is what we repeat in the responsorial psalm today. "Be merciful, O Lord, for we have sinned." So on this first Sunday of Lent, the readings invite us to look at our lives through the lens of God's lavishness and the permission that God gives us and train our will to do God's will through obedience like Jesus, which is what Paul tells us writing to Romans in the second reading. The relationship that was ruptured through the disobedience of Adam and Eve is now repaired, is now made well through the obedience of Jesus. And sin is not a private affair, it has a social dimension to it. There is a social dimension to what I do when I go against the permission of God and lose myself in the prohibition that God gives me. The sin that I commit has not only a personal affair to it, it has a communal dimension to it. What Paul tells us in the second reading is what Jesus does through his obedience. He is undoing the original disobedience. Obedience to overcome temptation, to train our will, and to do God's will. In the gospel reading, we see the desert experience of Jesus. On this very first Sunday, we are taken into the desert with Jesus for a training camp, for a boot camp, to train our will against the temptation. Again, the purpose is to focus on the permission and the lavishness of God's permission and to take our focus away from what is prohibited, unlike our first parents, Adam and Eve. So, on this very first Sunday, meeting Jesus in the desert is serving to us as a training camp to train our will, as a boot camp to be determined in doing God's will through obedience. And the 40 days that Jesus was tempted in the desert is an allusion to what happened in the Old Testament to Noah, to Moses, and to Prophet Elijah. During the days of Noah, there were 40 days of rain. And Moses spent 40 days on the mountain before he received the 10 Commandments. And Elijah traveled in the desert for 40 days, just only fed by the food that the angels gave him. So there is an allusion to what Jesus experiences in the New Testament as the new Noah, as the new Moses, and as the new Elijah. What is Jesus telling us through his obedience in the desert to God's will? He's telling us to train our will, is getting us back to the boot camp and to focus on the lavishness of God's permission and to take our attention away from prohibition. And these three temptations that Jesus faces from the devil in the desert addresses the material, the spiritual, and the civil needs that we have. It is not a mistake to meet our needs, but when we are not trained, when we are not in the boot camp, when we don't strengthen our will, the material and the spiritual and the civil temptations that the devil does with Jesus could become our own temptations. This is how the devil becomes so clever in taking our attention away from the lavishness of God's permission and asking us to just focus on the prohibition. In doing so, we are weakened in our will. So on this first Sunday of Lent, we are getting into the desert with Jesus, to the training camp, to the boot camp, to train our will, so that we are able to say through proper obedience to God, to say a strong no, and to accomplish God's will. The first temptation recalls God's gift of manna in the desert. The second temptation of Jesus shows Jesus' authentic sonship. And the third temptation, while the devil shows Jesus the kingdoms of the world, Jesus is fixed on God's kingdom and the vision of God's kingdom. All these three have a reference to the people of Israel with Moses in their 40 years of journey from Egypt to the promised land. On this first Sunday of Lent, we are drawn into the desert to train our will in proper obedience to God, so that we are saying constantly no to the prohibition and enjoy the lavishness of God's permission. On this first Sunday of Lent, encountering Jesus in the desert, we learn to train our will against the temptations of the devil and grow in our obedience to God. Father Praveen Lakkisetti, here at St. Pius X Catholic Church in San Antonio, Texas. Thank you and God bless.